All right. So on Tuesday, we spent some time talking about the things that would fall under the labels of religion for our purposes. So it is not just organized religion. It is kind of a larger way to relate to things that are bigger than us, bigger than what we understand, especially with modern science that explains a lot of things, but not quite all the things that we need. And so making sense of our lives usually will have this recourse to this thing that we cannot always classify in specific ways. Those things could be souls or ghosts or whatever they are, but they seem to make the things, the chaos that is around us fall into place. And of course, this is kind of how most of these origin stories work. You know, at first there's nothing and then there's something. The gods with their magical powers, with their supernatural powers, make the nonsense of life fall into some kind of order that we can make sense, at least to a certain extent. And of course, as a result of that, there's a bunch of ways that these things have been made out to. So it could be that you have many gods that take care of many aspects. It could be that you have one god that is omnipotent, that can do anything and everything. Generally speaking, of course, this will have to do with the larger foundations that people have laid for their lives in the context of wherever they live. And certainly the hardships that are faced by people in the Middle East 2,000 years ago or so are not quite the same as the hardships lived by people in, you know, the Amazon 500 years ago or in Vermont 1 minute ago. So obviously anthropology, as a result of that, has had kind of an evolving view of how to classify these different ways of thinking, because it might be useful to put all of this under the umbrella term of religion and make sense out of it as everybody has a relationship to a supernatural, but that doesn't give us the logic behind it. This is anthropology, the study of people, the logic of people. Max Weber studies what he starts to call the specifics of religion, and as he says here, the essence of religion is not even our concern, as we make it our task to study the conditions and effects of a particular type of social action. The external courses of religious behavior are so diverse that an understanding of this behavior can only be achieved from the viewpoint of the subjective experiences, notions, and purposes of the individuals concerned. In short, so from the viewpoint of the religious behavior's quote-unquote meaning. And of course, that's what I was talking about in my introduction there, is that organizing the wealth of our knowledge into specific categories is an operation of meaning. We are attaching labels to things, and sometimes that label is more or less scientific. Sometimes that label is more or less religious, but some people would argue that science is a form of religion, and some people would argue that religion is a form of science. So labels themselves are only serving so much of a purpose when it comes to the meaning of it generally. And the meaning of it for a group might be pretty different from the meaning of it for an individual, maybe a handful of individuals in a family or whatever. And I finished Tuesday's lecture talking about myths. Myths being those origin stories or these general foundation stories that people might have about their lives. And the myth can contain the origin of the world as much as it can contain the origin of those things unknown, those things unspoken. And we started Tuesday's lecture with a myth, and we're going to start today with another myth. Why are there no snakes in Tacoma? Long time ago, Taihi Sahale became angry with his people. Sahale ordered the medicine man to take his bow and arrow and shoot into the cloud which hung low over Tacoma. The medicine man shot the arrow and it stuck fast in the cloud. Then he shot another into the lower end of the first. Then he shot another into the lower end of the second. He shot arrows until he made a chain which reached from the cloud to the earth. The medicine man told his klutman, kind of a magician, and his children to climb up the arrow trail. Then he told the good animals to climb up the arrow trail. Then the medicine man climbed up himself. Just as he was climbing into the cloud, he looked back. A long line of bad animals and snakes were also climbing up the arrow trail. Therefore, the medicine man broke the chain of arrows. Thus, the snakes and bad animals fell down on the mountainside. Then at once it began to rain. It rained until all the land was flooded. Water reached even to the snow line of Tacoma. When all the bad animals and snakes were drowned, it stopped raining. After a while, the water sank again. Then the medicine man and his klutman and children climbed out of the cloud and came out the mountainside. The good animals also climbed out of the cloud. Thus, there are now no snakes or bad animals on Tacoma. Does this story ring a bell to anyone? Flood story, such as?
Mythology based on the Jewish and Christian stories.
Right. Jewish and Christian as in the Old Testament, New Testament. Mostly the Old Testament. There's one that's rather well known to most people, whether or not you believe in Christianity, Noah's Ark. And, I started this lecture with, obviously, people in different parts of the world would have different origin stories, right? Because the life of somebody living in the Middle East 2,000 years ago would obviously be different from the life of somebody living on Tacoma Mountain 500 years ago. And yet, what is this? We have a flood in both stories. Now, what is this story telling us or teaching us? It's in the title. There are no snakes in Tacoma. Okay. What is that teaching us in terms of what we talked about myths on the end of Tuesday's lecture? Anybody who goes outside sometimes? Outside of your house, outside of your home, maybe outside in the wilderness? Sure hope so, because you're here. You have to come outside at some point. When you stepped outside, did you think about how many snakes you were going to encounter? Yeah, to a certain extent. But for you as a person reading this story right now, why is it important to know that there are no snakes on Tacoma?
Aware of danger that you can have a life full of it. Snakes are dangerous.
Snakes typically are dangerous. They bite you, and you're in the middle of nowhere on the mountain. You kind of don't want to be bitten by a snake. Why would you be out of nowhere in the mountain? well, 2,000 years ago or more in the middle of the Middle East, the way that people subsisted, the way that people survived, the way that people fed themselves was to go into nature to find food. And 500 years ago, on Tacoma Mountain, when people needed to get food, they relied on nature. They had to get food. And mountains, pretty much everywhere you look, are kind of an important way to get food, because mountains have a very specific climate associated with them. Because of the way that the weather works, once the air meets the mountain, the air rises and condenses really quickly, which creates rain, and rain makes things grow on the side of mountains. And of course, because the mountains are a little bit out of the way from the valleys, then you find different kinds of food on the mountain sides than you find in other places. Maybe it's a little bit more difficult to get, and so people will go there out of their own way to find the food that is there. On Tuesday, we also mentioned that some mountains are volcanoes. And of course, volcanoes, because they are these active, lively thing in our universe, they spew all kinds of minerals that come down from the earth. They spew ashes, they spew nitrogen. Ashes and nitrogen are important because that's fertilizers. And pretty much every volcano you look at, those things make all kinds of fruit grow. And as a result of that, if and when you have to go to the mountain to find food, and that mountain just happens to be a volcano, that mountain is an important source of livelihood for you. Now, of course, and on top of that, you have a story like the one we mentioned on Tuesday, where the gods make this mountain come out of the earth for you, specifically the people who are listening to this story. Now you have this food that is given to you by the gods, that is available for you. But also there are snakes out there, because God makes everything. God also made the snakes. So what do? Do you die of starvation in the valley, or do you risk your life going into the mountains? Unless, of course, God, being as great and powerful as he is, it is whatever God is, also made it so that there are no snakes on the mountains. It's kind of nice. All of these things add up to a good universe that we live in, and certainly makes your life to be slightly more anxiety-ridden than it needs to be. What Weber mentioned in the first slide is something that is pretty important for ethnography and anthropology as well. The idea that you are looking at stuff from the point of view of people. We mentioned that this was a participant observation from Boaz, understanding the meaning of things from the point of view of the people who are listening. And again, this is an exercise that is pretty important, putting yourself in the shoes of people who are hearing these myths, because listening to particular stories about ourselves, no, we don't necessarily have to think too critically about them, why things are the way they are, why we approach things in the way we want to approach them, or we approach them on a daily basis, why we do the things we do, because for the most part, these things are set up for us by somebody somewhere, and we assume that those things are set up well, reliably, safely, whatever. And this is something that is obviously a big concern for religious purposes, because as I mentioned, if you assume that religion is always an organized form of religion, the way that Christianity is, then you're going to think about religion in the specific way that Christianity is created. That's whether or not you actually are Christians or believe in the stories behind it, because that's another step in another direction. That being said, the principle remains the same. Here in the United States, you are raised with a general knowledge of all stuff biblical, whether or not you believe in it. The founding fathers and all that. We'll talk about those guys in a little bit, not today, though. And of course, here, the idea that we have mentioned previously of assuming that other people are primitive or have these basic understandings about the world have also translated for religious systems. The systems of thinking that are seen as inferior for some reason because they don't have an all-powerful God like the Abrahamic God. So Malinowski, we mentioned him before in the context of economy a couple of weeks ago, says, besides the firm outline of tribal constitution and crystallized cultural items which form the skeleton, besides the data of daily life and ordinary behavior, which are, so to speak, its flesh and blood, there is still to be recorded the spirit, the natives' views and opinions and utterances. Because whether or not you believe those people are inferior, and again, Malinowski for the most part did, well, you kind of have to put yourself in those shoes. You kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is certainly not living in the way that you have. Again, whether it is 2,000 years ago in the Middle East or 500 years ago in the mountains, either way, people are not living your life, and understanding their ways of thinking, their ways of meaning, means understanding their way of living as well. Something else that Malinowski put out in the same book, to grasp the native's point of view, his relation to life, to realize his vision of his world. And that is probably the most difficult way that you can make sense out of meaning, because religion is not always very clear. It's not always set out in specific ways. And something that is going to be recurring in the next weeks moving forward as well is the fact that we today are pretty lucky to have an educational system that we can access. You know, you might need a little bit of money to get there, but for the most part, the first few years of elementary school, middle school, and high school are very accessible. That wasn't the case in the early 1920s when Malinowski was writing. That definitely was not the case at any point before that. And as a result, the knowledge systems that go into science up until the 19th century are very different from ours. And more importantly, the religious systems, which also do not rely on the specific structured, formulated education and that such, unless, again, you make those steps to go through the educational system. And for example, Catholicism has a very structured way that you are learning the Gospels and that you are going through church so many times a week to get those things. That's not always the case in every kind of belief systems. For our context, we actually can look back at E.B. Tyler. We have mentioned him very early on in this class as the guy who believed that primitive, quote unquote, people are these survivals of our ancient past. And this is why he was interested in looking at non-Western, non-European people, was to look at how religion used to be. And again, we don't subscribe to that. We have kind of made our peace with that guy, but the general idea that he points out that, of course, there is a different way to think there is very important. And Tyler was instrumental in changing our view of religion in that context. He brought up this term, mentioned here in 1871, I propose here under the name of animism to investigate the deep-lying doctrine of spiritual beings, which embodies the very essence of spiritualistic as opposed to materialistic philosophy. Animism is not a new technical term, though now seldom used. So he brings up this technical term of animism. And so animism is, as he mentions here, as he sees it, a deep-lying doctrine of spiritual beings, which is pretty useful for anthropology because it sheds this language of gods and goddesses and, you know, other kinds of things that seem to be supernaturally human, because sometimes you don't have a supernatural God person. You have a supernatural force that just moves through your people, maybe an energy, if you will, however you want to think of it, that helps the universe move and helps you move and helps everything move around you, helps your life make sense. And the spiritual being, in a sense, doesn't have to be personified, as we mentioned on Tuesday. Furthermore, pointing this out as a matter of a spiritualistic as opposed to materialistic also moves us to the possibility of these non-human beings around us that also seem to have a lived experience. That being said, by any sense of the term now, looking at non-human beings, they don't particularly seem to have a religious system. You might argue that your dog or your cat sees ghosts sometimes because they have these weird reflexes that don't make sense to you. This is actually part of Darwin's Origin of Species. He has this moment when he's sitting on his porch and he sees his dog just flutter because a thing has moved in the distance, and he observes, oh, this is funny, it looks like he saw a ghost, because what he saw was the umbrella move in the wind, and the dog cannot explain how the wind is moving, and so Darwin sees that as a spiritual force in the dog's life. So if we think of the unexplained for a dog as the wind being able to move an umbrella, the unexplained for us could be anything that we cannot explain by, again, our modern forms of science. That leads us to this view of what he calls animism as something that allows for the movement around us to make sense. And the way that things make sense is what we typically call the soul. In the Abrahamic doctrines, for example, you have the God who makes people out of mud, just takes a bunch of mud, puts it together, and there you go, you got Adam. But Adam is just mud up until God breathes, literally blows a soul into the mud. And so people, of course, in that context, are made out of material, mud, and the breath of God, the soul. So thinking of animism as this doctrine of souls or spiritual beings, today that would lead us to what people would tend to call, being spiritual. Kind of believing that there's this soul inside of us, generally speaking, that doesn't have to be attached to a organized religion, that doesn't have to be organized around the church even, that could just be, you think that there's something bigger than us, and that bigger thing could be literally anything. So using Tyler's definition here as animism, the general doctrine of souls and other spirituals and other spiritual beings in general, helps us move through those stages of thinking about religion as, do you understand or do you think of the human being as being a little bit more than material? More than material, as in more than the body of flesh and blood and whatever they are. Weird goo that we are stepping into every day. Turning this into something more than weird goo. And of course, I think most people would tend to agree that we are more than weird goo. And so on a much larger sense, whether you believe in the organized religious form of religion or whether you believe in the quote-unquote animism that Tyler saw, the idea of soul is what gives life to things. To people, of course, because people have to be more than weird goo, but also to the animals, because the animals obviously are more than weird goo as well. Perhaps the pets are a little bit less weird goo than others, but the wild animals out there also seem to have a little bit more of an experience than just standing there. They seem to have an animation to themselves. Being animated is to have a soul. That's literally animism, where the word comes from. Anything, really. Literally anything that moves you, maybe physically. And, in a very general sense, being able to breathe, it's kind of a proof that we're alive. If you no breathe, you no live, to be very plain about it. So breathing, the machinery, the animation of the body is very literally, materialistically, what keeps us alive. You don't need to put a spiritual sense behind that. But you may, if you think about it, think of the ways in which each one of those parts of your existence is coming together in ways that you cannot always explain in materialistic ways. If you don't have the science for it, if you don't go to school for most of your life for it, obviously it seems like the knowledge of these scientific facts has to do much more with your belief than anything else. And pretty quickly, the idea of souls and what the soul of things is turns into a concept that becomes known as fetishism. Today, fetishism is not something that you would typically expect in the context of an anthropology class. or an everyday discussion for that matter. But it goes down to this idea of materialism. Fetishism is how early European travelers who were thinking about people who understood the world differently from themselves thought that those natives, those primitive people, those quote unquote savages, those people that they do not understand, just put souls in everything. And as a result of that, when you are traveling from, let's say, Portugal to South America, and you have these bells that are just pretty useful for your boat, but not particularly valuable because bells are made, hand over fist in your country. You get to South America and you meet indigenous folks there, and those indigenous folks have gold. Hand over fist gold. You're in Portugal, you don't have gold, you have bells. But little by little, you live your life in South America and you realize that these indigenous folks are very interested in your bells. And as a result of this, Portuguese travelers saw that maybe, or in the way that they were thinking, the natives thought that those bells had a soul into them. Because those savages, those primitive people cannot explain the sound of things in the way that Portuguese science did. They had to, in their mind, assume that what makes the sound of a bell is some kind of soul. And of course, the vibration here is a matter of a movement as well, of course. But if you've never heard a bell before, it seems like a bell is kind of magical in this way. And through colonialism, this idea spreads out to Africa, again through the Portuguese, to South America and North America as well. Pretty much anywhere you go is that you have this maybe childlike excitement about things that Western/European people cannot explain in weird ways. And they make sense out of it as of a matter of soul. The word fetishism comes to us from Portuguese, the word feticcio, which in French becomes the word gris-gris or juju. Again, this childlike excitement, right? You're repeating a sound and you just put a weird name to it. And so feticcio is what the Portuguese called these toys, these things that you cannot ascribe any specific value to as a Portuguese person, but that those indigenous people did ascribe some value to. And that value is, again, what they would think of a soul. And gris-gris also becomes the matter of soul. And this, once again, once it reaches Africa, turns into what people would understand as voodoo religion today. Although, of course, from the point of view of the French colonials, voodoo is not a religion. It's a weird cult that doesn't make any sense, that uses magic, that is nothing like the way that we see religion, of course. But today, the way that gris-gris comes out is this, again, magical sense of a thing that you cannot explain why has this mysterious force to it. And if it has a mysterious force to it, it's only a step to figure out that this thing could actually give agency to objects. A symbolic meaning, perhaps a spiritual meaning, or a political or economic or whatever. Because then, of course, those Portuguese, French travelers, eventually the British join in as well. They start to trade those meaningless things for their meaningful things. They trade bells for gold. And they think they made out like bandits, of course, because to them, the gold is very valuable. To the natives, the bells are not worth anything. So therefore, they win, as Europeans always do. To put this in the context of what Tyler was telling us about just a second ago, this is essentially trading a material thing, the bell, for a non-material thing, the gold. Because the gold in itself is not worth anything. What is worth the gold is the weight in gold. It's the things that you can do with the gold. And in fact, for the indigenous folks, the same thing works with them. The gold is not worth anything to them, but the bells, the enjoyment of hearing this sound is worth a whole lot more than this weird metal that they have everywhere. Weird trade that happens here, but a trade for material versus not so material. And in this context, it becomes a matter of commodity fetishism. That people assume a certain value for certain things. And for us today, it is actually interesting to consider gold as a matter of commodity fetishism. Because gold is literally worth nothing. There's plenty of it everywhere in the world. You don't need to have more gold except to make electronics, perhaps. And even then, we have better alternatives than gold. But thinking that gold is more valuable than it is a matter of fetishism. Is a weird leftover from 400 years ago when back in Europe, there just wasn't that much gold. And so therefore, they just wanted all the gold. And now today, people still want all the gold for some reason. And fast forward a few years, it turns into sexual fetishism. Once again, you are transforming an object that means probably nothing, that is materially not particularly useful to you, into something a little bit more meaningful. A personal enjoyment, maybe a couple enjoyment. I don't know what weird thing people consider fetishes these days, but you get the idea. The idea remains that things are more than they seem, that an object can have more meaning to you than it has to somebody else, to the next person next to you. A concept might have more meaning to you than the person next to you. And fetishism is a bridge for us in anthropology to think of putting value into objects. Like these objects right here. Now, this is actually part of an exhibit, so it's not like a weird discovery that is made in the Amazon of something spooky, but, you know. How do you explain this? What could this be? What is the meaning of this? Because that is the subject of today's lecture. Bless you. Yes.
Maybe like blue dolls or something like that.
It could.
Well, they're like people sticks.
People sticks. That's probably a scientific term, yes.
They remind me of like really small totem poles.
Really small totem poles. We're going to get to that in a second.
No, but it's somehow very useful in some way. I don't know. I think it's going to be like a.
What makes you think that?
They kind of remind me of like ordinary like types that you like go into and I don't know all that. They remind me of it.
So they're lined up, obviously, in some kind of intentional way, in a way that reminds you of organ pipes, perhaps. They are so carved in very apparently intentional manners, right, that seem to have faces on them. Maybe a characters to them. Again, right, you're in the mountains or in the savannah, wherever it is that you are not in your place, and you come across this thing. How do you feel? What do you understand from this? There's no wrong answers here.
Seem like a deterrent, like if you're walking in the jungle and you come across this, like, I guess it's meant to be kind of spooky. There are people here and it kind of provides like a wall or something.
Now, what do you mean there are people here?
There are faces.
Okay, so these
There's
things are
animals
faces.
here and people are watching you.
Who's we?
There are faces.
Okay, so these guys pictured here. Can you imagine this as a weird, blink or nest alarm on your front lawn that these things are watching you? It's like a security camera if you don't have security cameras. Because obviously someone had to put these things here, right? Someone spent the effort of carving wood and placing them in this intentional manner in displays for a reason. Somebody is there. Somebody. Which, if you're walking in the forest, in the savannah, wherever it is that you're walking, you don't have to expect that there's somebody out there. Right? I mean, you're just living your life gathering berries or hunting animals and whatever. This is your land, as far as you know. All of this is yours until there's a sign of life. There's a sign that somebody's there. So again, we're putting some kind of meaning into a weird representation of something almost human, quasi-human, or, that has a human face anyway. And again, in very materialistic term, having a face is pretty important to surviving. Very hard to breathe otherwise. So having these weird shaped bodies with weird shaped faces reminds us that there are things and objects out there that are meaningful to us, maybe meaningful to somebody else whose meaning we do not always understand. And the idea of totems comes to us from a psychologist, Sigmund Freud, who read a whole lot of anthropology and pretty much ruined the discipline with his weird ideas of sexual stuff, but what can you do? Freud taught about totemism. Totemism is religious as well as a social system. On its religious side, it consists of the relations of mutual respect and consideration between a person and his totem. And on its social side, it is composed of obligations to the members of the clan towards each other and towards other tribes. Now, again, this is, I think it should be 1921. I forgot a number there. That's okay. This is the early 20th century. When he's saying clan here, he's misusing the word. Clan is a Celtic way to organize your family, but because Europeans don't know anything about anything, they just use European terms for everything. Clan is used for African peoples, for American peoples, for all kinds of people out there. But as he points out here, totemism, or putting a soul into an object and that object becomes a representative of your social group, is a pretty widespread ways that all kinds of people groups organize their lives into thing groups. And of course, if you gather enough people groups into large enough series of thing groups, you get this system of totemism where you can recognize specific groups and their existence by the objects that they make. If you live in a place such as this one, and you see an object that says this one, and you don't know anything about this, not only do you know that there are people there, but you know that those people are strangers, because your people certainly didn't make that. Nobody you know makes this kind of thing. These objects here, whatever they represent, it doesn't matter to you. Represent somebody else's view, somebody else's universe. And when you see this, you're entering these people's universe, their world, their nature that they think is theirs. And if you cross this path of these things there and you eat the berries that are past this point, or you hunt the animals that are past this point, they see you. Maybe they see you through these weird little characters here. Maybe they see you because they are actually around, even though you don't see them. And so here we have this kind of meeting of the larger spiritual system, meeting with the things that we make with the cultural system and the social system, as Freud points it out, in the way in which people on the social side have a responsibility to others, responsibility to warn others that you are here and they are not. Or you are here and they are not welcome. Or that your people are here and have been here for a long time, your ancestors. Because who knows how long those totems, those stick people have been there in the forest. could have been there for 10, 15, 100 years. And of course, this establishes your presence and their presence, your ancestors' presence, over a place for a long amount of time. Now, when we think of totems today, and especially for our purposes, we think of these kinds of totems especially. Once again, combining the religious sense and what we have called in this class previously, kinship, the social system, the social relations of people. And in North America, especially when we are using those totems, we are also representing these material relationships that we have to the world with the spiritual world around us, around the people around us, of course. These kind of totems, you have animals that represent the different generations of people through different animals. And so meeting these particular totems tells you the kinds of people that exist, the kind of relationships that they have with themselves, what today's people tend to call quote unquote spirit animals, which is new age way to talk about totems, but remains pretty much the same as animism from Tyler. That you have this connection to the universe around you that goes beyond your nature, your weird goo that you are stepping in every morning when you wake up. Is not just the weird goo, it's the weird goo of your ancestors that has been forged over hundreds of years, thousands of years. I don't know how long you want to trace your ancestry, but you've been here. Your parents have been here. Your grandparents have been here. They've all been here for this whole time. And of course, through these times, you have learned through tradition who you are related to, who your parents are, where they come from, how they relate to each other, how your particular group is connected to this particular group, how your particular quote unquote spirit animal is connected to the other quote unquote spiritual animal. And that builds your sense of identity. It literally identifies you to the people around you, identifies you to strangers, identifies you to the world around you as well, because you are connected through the natural world. And that forms a much larger principle of protection, of guidance, of a way in which people will live their lives. Literally, once again, organize the big nonsense of this world into a slightly less nonsensical world. One that is guided by something, one that is animated by something that is some kind of intention to it. You're not just wandering every day into a weird forest, wondering if there's snakes. Just turns out that we have mostly eliminated the snakes they put in cities, but if you go into the mountains, once again, kind of nice to know if there are snakes and what they are and how dangerous they are. And again, we have science to do that now. You don't always have to do that. If you see a snake on the trail, you can pull out your phone and see, oh, this is this kind of snake, I'm good. Questions about this so far? By the way? As I mentioned before, I can go all day talking about this, so if you have any questions, please ask, because I will not get tired of talking. Oops. Now, I mentioned how Freud ruined everything for most of us. Freud connected the idea of totemism to a much larger possibility, because if the animals and the ancestors and the people and the nature are all connected to one another through these systems, and we can identify those systems, then what happens to the others? Once again, we have to worry about our world besides ourselves. And besides ourselves, there are people who are not connected to us through nature, through animals, through totems. And we know they are there. This is kind of how life works. In the later history of totemism, these two sides show a tendency to part company. The social system often survives the religious, and conversely, remnants of totemism remain in the religion of countries in which the social system based upon totemism has disappeared. In the present state of our ignorance about the origin of totemism, we cannot say with certainty how these two sides were originally combined. You know, kind of just getting away with saying, well, actually, I just made all this up. But, you know, when you're a big shot, you can say that. Because you get this scientific way to explain things and you get the possibility of others showing up. Once the totem is separated from its meaning, once the people are separated from this meaning, once the social system remains and people don't necessarily think of themselves as related to a totem, and once again, Freud is thinking of this as this weird evolutionary system. So as far as he's seeing here, people from quote unquote modern religions, such as Abrahamic religions, see themselves through these totems of Jesus Christ, Muhammad, the Quran, the Bible, the cross, all those things, as essentially remnants of totems of the ancient days, that people have these objects that they recognize as a matter of social significance and a matter of religious significance. And in other words, you can just wave a magical crucifix and say, well, these are our people, and whoever follows the body of Christ follows me, of course. Not sure if it's right or wrong here, but there might be something to dig into that. The idea that if religion is a matter of the spiritual as opposed to the material, why do we have these weird material things that keep on coming back to us? That if you think of, you know, the Abrahamic God giving you the world and giving you the mud that Adam is made out of and putting God's breath into that to turn Adam into more than a human, if we attach our lives to the material things, the crosses, the Bibles, as much as, you know, the world around us, you know, everything else that God apparently made, aren't we kind of doing the totemism thing? Are we actually as modern as we think he is? And, you know, Freud's whole argument is that we're not, that we're all savages that don't know anything about anything. But, you know, like I said, Freud is not the greatest role model we have. He is, however, a way to think about these things in ways that especially people in the Christian world, European world, Abrahamic world as a whole, have thought about the lives around them. And of course, if you look at Christian religion in the early 20th century, you have kind of a spectrum of people who are more or less attached to the materialist. Protestants are not so much attached to the church as a thing. They're more attached to the Bible as a thing. On the other hand, Catholics are more attached to the church, the building as a thing, and a bit less attached to the word of the Bible as a thing. And, you know, you can extend that to Orthodox people in Russia and in the Middle East, in America, in other places where people have been touched by Christianity at some point and then became different in different parts of the world. That however much Christians today would like to think that all Christians are the same, American Christians would make a lot of people angry out in the Christian world. Because it's not as simple as this. There's a social system behind it. There's a meaning system behind it. And it's not easily boiled down to one object or even a series of objects for that matter. There it is. And so we go back to Malinowski that we started today with. Malinowski looking at people in Papua New Guinea, looking at the way in which they do the religious thing in the religion aspect of their life. And as early as the 20th century, of course, Malinowski observes that modern anthropology, which had not questioned the recognition that magic and religion are not merely a doctrine of philosophy, not merely an intellectual body of opinion, but a special mode of behavior, A pragmatic attitude built up of reason, feeling, and will alike. It is a mode of action as well as a mode of belief and a sociological phenomenon as well as a personal experience. Now, magic in this sense is similar to religion. It's similar to most of what we have talked about today. There's a whole body of people using the word magic to avoid the word religion, but as I mentioned Tuesday, magic as of now is just as loaded as the word religion, so it doesn't make much difference for us which one we use. But it's not just that people think that they can do magic or they can do religion, it's that they are basing their entire life around it. They have a whole meaning system based around it. Recognizing that meaning system means recognizing your people, and you can feel connected to Christians all around the world because you have the same body of belief, but it doesn't mean that you actually have a one system working around that. Not necessarily that you have one big family of Christians that spans the entirety of the world, just because you've read the same book at some point, or somebody read the same book to you. So there's part of it is a reasonable thinking about religion or a reasonable putting meaning into things. Part of that is also a feeling, and part of that is a will as well. And in other words, you have to, once again, kind of put your entire understanding of the world into a system of religious belief to understand the entire meaningful system behind it. Now, if you're in my linguistic class here, we're going to link up to something we have mentioned quite a bit in the past couple of weeks. If you separate the body from the soul, if you separate the belief from the society, then what happens? If you assume that people who read the same book all believe the same thing, if you assume that people who say they believe in all the same deity all are the same, what happens?
Culture, right?
Kind of, but I guess in the specifics, it depends on the culture, but if you see somebody and you think that they believe a certain thing and that happens to be not that thing that they believe in. Or put it in other terms, you see those totems in the forest that we mentioned a second ago, and you believe that those things are friendly faces that tell you that, look, we're cool, happy people in the forest. Come see us up close. And it turns out they're not. What happens?
Read the situation wrong.
Yes. And what happens when you read the situation wrong? Is it positive? Is it positive? Well, let's just put it down.
It's not positive.
Okay. There's a problem there, right? If you assume that people are friendly and turns out they're not, you have a problem. If you assume that people are not friendly and you step away, you won't have that problem. So that kind of solves that. But again, separating the society from the beliefs, separating the material from the spiritual, could lead to some problems.
I just want to say that always stepping away from the situation, yeah, you're always going to be fine, but you're never going to have any fun. There's no real safety. There's no rewards.
Yeah, I think that's a personal value at that point. Hey, they have 50-50 chance of dying.
You get a chance to die when you walk across the street.
It's not 50-50.
We're so infinitely small. the only point of life is to take risks.
Oh, right. I mean, okay, that's assuming that you want to be alive, which I don't. But the idea is that you're walking around trying to preserve some kind of order, then yes.
Again, personal choice.
Right. Just, I mean, if you're thinking it in terms of the universe doesn't care if you're alive or not.
So why don't you take all the risks? Why don't you meet all the people?
Well, because I care. Right? Again, 50-50 chance. The universe doesn't, I do, or we have to meet in the middle somewhere.
So then you have to sometimes take the chance to meet.
Or not.
That's not really good.
So I have the internet. Now, the bigger problem, which you might know from listening to Freud or from having heard anything about society and how it worked, is what he calls a taboo. We could kind of link up to the idea of fetishism that we mentioned a second ago. Freud talks about taboo as the primeval prohibition forcibly imposed by some authority from outside and directed against the most powerful longings to which human beings are subject. The desire to violate it persists in their unconscious. Those who obey the taboo have an ambivalent attitude to what the taboo prohibits. Our assertion that taboo originated in a primeval prohibition imposed at one time or other by some external authority is obviously incapable of demonstration. Once again, right? Pretty cool, Freud. No, can't prove it, I'm just saying that it is. What we shall rather endeavor to confirm, therefore, are the psychological determinants of taboo, which we have learnt to know from obsessional neurosis. If you break the rules of how your society works, you commit what Freud calls a taboo. That is, that you do a thing that your people say is prohibited. Such as, walking into traffic, not paying attention to where the traffic is coming from. It's probably not the right idea. Everybody would see that. Maybe if in your own personal view, it doesn't matter. Maybe in the whole universe's view, it doesn't matter. Most likely you are going to see people around you that have some questions about you if you start walking into traffic, not paying attention. Well, same idea with other things that we kind of understood as prohibited or not accepted, uncouth, if you will, things that you see that are not beneficial to society as a whole and should therefore not be done. Whether or not they can be done is a different question, because of course you can. You can do anything you want anytime. None of that matters. But society and the way that those things are structured in society and the things that you learn from these society, what Freud associates with a primitive behavior, but is in fact just simply a cultural behavior of doing things that you think are good by your cultural ideas and doing things that are perhaps not as beneficial. Then you're breaking the rules of the social group as a whole. And so, of course, in that context, taboo can be anything, such as using the Lord's name in vain. If you say God too many times, you're bringing God upon you by the principle of magics that we mentioned on Tuesday. You say God, God, God 3 times in front of the mirror, and God appears, and he smites you right there and then. Like Candyman in Bloody Mary. Anybody got any cool taboo that we can talk about right now?
Beetlejuice.
What's that?
You say Beetlejuice is like pretty fun.
Oh, Beetlejuice, yes, of course. Talking about actual taboos, things that we cannot talk about.
Grace.
Grace?
Priests.
Oh, priests.
Like that whole symbol, we just don't talk about it.
Well,
Is that a wrong one?
yeah, that's true. But mostly the church doesn't talk about it much.
Yeah, the church doesn't talk about it.
Right.
Maybe just go to church.
Yeah. Lots of people do talk about it. There's a person that's been, I worked in Lafayette before in Louisiana, and there's a guy that's been walking in front of the cathedral every day for 12 years now with a sign that says, you know, they basically look up the report that says about all the kids raped by priests. It's fun times. Some people think about it. Rape is definitely a taboo that people don't talk about much.
Race is also a taboo.
Yeah, I was about to say, but I think that's getting into a very theological discussion that has to happen here. Incest, also a taboo. There are things that you don't want to talk about much because if you talk about it, then you conjure the images around it. If you conjure the images about it, it makes the whole system shakier. It creates anxiety. It makes people feel not good about themselves, about society, and of course, it makes the social group a lot more difficult to deal with if you start thinking about all the horrible things that people do to each other all the time. Yes?
PTSD in the military is pretty taboo.
PTSD in the military. Because many people have it.
It's the highest of people in the country that have the most money and how they control.
Sure. And again, we're kind of at a point here where there's a lot of people that talk about it and a lot of people who don't. And it's kind of reaching this tipping point where people are talking about this more than they used to. Yes.
Like Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, probably. Again, right, it's the same idea is that there's a lot of people that talk about it, a lot of people who don't.
True, but even when you do talk about it, it doesn't make it,
Yeah.
I guess, less, I think, like sketchy.
Sure, yeah, or gross in general. But
Yeah.
again, it goes back to priests and children and rape in general. It's just once you name enough names that do enough wrong things, it turns out that there's a lot more gross stuff in the world that most people would bargain for. And again, makes life a very different thing than just walking around happily ever after. Yes? No. Because I would love to talk about conspiracy theories. I've been trying to teach a course on conspiracy theories, but it's a lot to explain. But because conspiracy theories, about 90% of them boil down to anti-Semitism. So it's really easy to think of in this sense. But on the other hand, now it's getting to a point where, again, right, you think that a lot of things that have been mentioned right now, like Catholic priests, like Jeffrey Epstein and all that, and powerful people having a lot of money, that all boils down to things that a lot of people know, but that's still very specific to specific groups. So if you start thinking of it as, you know, every man is a rapist, it's not solving any problem, even though it's true there's a lot of them and it's terrible and it's people should be ashamed of that. That if you turn it into a conspiracy theory, it's no longer a taboo anymore. It's just like you're talking about this all the time. It becomes an obsession much more than anything else. But the way that they work, though, is talking about things that people don't talk about much. So in a way, yes, and you know, and anti-Semitism and people being organized around specific groups of hatred for hundreds of years at this point. It's very difficult to explain those things without essentially blaming the Catholic Church for it. And, you know, if you read Catholic texts from essentially the 3rd century to the 10th century, it's all overtly anti-Semitic. All of it is Jews are responsible for killing Jesus and everything, even though Jesus is a Jew, right? And that's where this situation comes from. It's like, well, we can't talk about these people that we came from because we were all Jewish in the year 0, and now we don't call ourselves Jewish. It comes from a thing you don't want to talk about, and it turns into an obsession. So I guess in a certain way it starts from it, but it turns into a political lifestyle that is very different from taboo. Because, you know, again, the idea of conspiracy theory is that you talk openly about those things, right? So you're saying things that you think you shouldn't talk about, like aliens, which there's nothing to talk about, but you want to talk about it because you think it's forbidden. It's not forbidden, it's just you have no proof for it. Okay. All right, well, that was fun. He thought he would take home all the yakua he could carry and climb the mountain again for more. He covered the hole with stones and covered the stones with snow. But one thing he did not do, he did not leave a gift for the spirits. He should have put a string of shells around the stone with the salmon head at the top, or another round the stone with the camas bulb at the top, and two round the stone with the elk's head at the top. But he was too selfish and too greedy to be thankful. Staggering under his load of shells, the man started to climb up the side of the crater. At once, the chief otter jumped down from his perch. At once, the 12 other otters fell into line with great puffs. They marched to the lake, plunged in, and began to beat the water with their tails. The man was so loaded with shells and the snow was so soft that it took him an hour to reach the rim of the crater. There, he stopped and looked back. A thick mist was rising from the lake where the otters were splashing. Under the mist was a black cloud which grew bigger and blacker as he watched. Are the spirits in that cloud? He asked himself in terror. He hurried, started down the mountain, but the black cloud followed him. The cloud became the storm, which threw down on the jagged rocks and ice. He clung to the yakua, struggled to his feet, and started again. The storm grew worse. In the wind and the thunder, the man heard the voices of Tamawawis, the spirits shrieking, ha ha, yakua, ha ha ha. Yakua is just beads. What people in the Northeast would call the wampum. Just valuable things. So what's happening here? Yes.
Sort of a man who like gets awesome things and then goes with like they respect the spirits, and so he gets punished because of it.
Okay. How does he get punished?
Not only just an apple from some weird like shrieking spirits.
Yeah, shrieking spirits, fire and brimstone. He didn't pay tribute to nature. He broke a taboo. He did a thing that he should not do by gathering a bunch of stuff and not leaving some for the spirits. You know, that is for other people out there, for nature, for the rest of the world. He was too greedy. He was too greedy and he was punished. Punished by who? So what?
Spirits and otters.
Spirits, otters. See the part where he walks up to a crater there? Walks up to a crater and then there's a black cloud of smoke that starts raining snow and soot on him. He's being punished by the mountains. He went to the mountain spirit, stole the mountain stuff, got punished by the mountain. Broke a taboo. Very hard to come back from taboo because they break the order of things. This is one of those kind of quote unquote capital punishments, the things that are so bad that you need to make amends. You need to make personal work to get out of it. Margaret Mead describes taboo as a negative sanction, a prohibition whose infringement results in an automatic penalty without human or superhuman mediation. There's no God that can save you once you create a taboo. You've done the thing that you shouldn't do. So in this case, the taboo is useful because it conveys both the religious aspect and the human aspect, without being particularly either one of those. Maybe the spirits themselves cannot punish you. Maybe the people themselves cannot punish you because they cannot see you. But you're punished by the universe for the bad things that you did. And of course, in that context, you get a sense of justice. You get a sense of whatever those people did in their life will get punished in some way. And of course, that will make our world better somehow, some way, somehow. And of course, a lot of that you could kind of assume at some point, once you've seen enough religious systems, once you've assumed enough things about enough people around, that everybody has some kind of way in which you have a deity that can punish you for the things that you have done. Clifford Geertz talks about yet one more meticulous case in point for such well-established propositions as that ancestor worship supports the jural authority of elders, that initiation rites are meant for the establishment of sexual identity and adult status, that ritual groupings reflect political oppositions, that myths provide charters for social institutions and rationalizations of social privilege, may well finally convince a great many people, both inside the profession and out, that anthropologists are, like theologians, firmly dedicated to proving the indubitable. That once you've done all that work of trying to boil everything down to the basics, that you just have the supernatural power that makes things right and supernatural that makes things wrong, then, you know, everybody's religion works the same. And obviously that's not the case. That's why we needed to move away from Malinowski, from Freud, from most of the people we have mentioned so far. Another picture of this volcano here. I don't. Any questions about all this? Well, when you put all of these ideas together, you create a system of ethics, or ethos, as Geertz calls it. And of course, that today tends to take into account the aspects of religion and society and whatever else is concerned around it. At various times for various individuals in various cultures, religion, infusing ethos and worldview gives to a set of social values what they perhaps need the most to be coercive, an appearance of objectivity. Its sacred rituals and myths values are portrayed not as subjective human preferences, but as the imposed conditions for life implicit in a world with a particular structure. So once these systems of religious belief reach out into the system of social behavior and you kind of forget the religious system behind it, you do things because the culture expects you to, that becomes a matter of ethics or ethos, even though it has a somewhat deeply religious value inside of it, or spiritual value if you want to talk about it that way. The three myths that we've talked about this week are all about the same mountain, Mount Rainier. Tacoma is the word mountain for the people of the Salish coast, Salish Sea. So 3 sets of stories about clouds and mountains and punishments coming from the same place from 3 different groups in the same area. Any questions about all this?
Where's the mountain?
Mount Rainier?
Yeah.
Between North California and South Oregon. The United States, West Coast. Right, well, you have the test due on the Blackboard on Sunday. Don't forget to complete that. Don't forget to take a look at the essay that's due at the end of the month. And we'll talk about all this next week.